Hi, this is Jim Clemmer. Welcome to our webinar. We're now about to get rolling. This session is built on the premise that you've listened to the earlier webcast, either live on November 4th or archived on our website. And as you know, that was quite a drink from a fire hose. I covered a lot of territory and very quickly and broadly tried to condense years of our experience and perspectives and research into a short period of time. What I'm going to do today is build on that further and talk about what sorts of approaches we use, bring you some experiences, some examples from clients, and the sorts of services that we provide. So we'll do this in two main parts, well, maybe three, subpart at the end, but the two main parts are for the next 20-25 minutes, I'm going to give you an overview of the major implementation steps around those five points that were at the end of the slide near the last part of the webcast, the November 4th webcast. And we make this distinction between a webcast and a webinar. Maybe it's just in my mind I make the distinction, but a webcast is all one way. I was broadcasting information out to everybody. The webinar is where we're going to ask you over the next 25 minutes or so to be texting in your questions or any comments that you might make. I have Julie Gill with me here today in my office, and Julie is monitoring the texting as they come in. You'll hear her voice later on when she'll then read some of the questions that are coming in. I'll continue on with looking at what are the kinds of things that the culture initiatives really focus on. This was in the last webcast where we talked about, I've added a few and changed a few here, but these are essentially the sort of focal points of many of the efforts to improve culture. And as you take a look at this list, there's probably one or two or three that really focus in on what your organization is trying to do. So that is always step number one, is clarifying what are we trying to do with this culture. Because just changing culture for the sake of changing culture doesn't really make much sense. It's just change for the sake of change. It's what are we trying to do with this culture? What are we trying to focus this culture on? What sort of changes are we trying to make in the effectiveness of the organization? So with that kind of the beginning point, we then step back, and our first major step here is to assess our current systems, practices, culture, and readiness. Now, here's where we hit the first of a broad number of differences in different clients that we work with. Some organizations have done some parts of this already. Others have done a fair bit of it. Lots haven't done really too much. Some don't want to do a lot and jump straight into the next few steps and then do a little bit of on the fly. So there's quite a range. But to come back to what we saw in the webcast originally, this book that I had quoted from extensively that summarizes the McKinsey work and the McKinsey study, this massive 10-year study, is showing just how critical assessment is. And it really is a point where slowing down means that we're going to be laying good groundwork and going ahead. And so part of what we're trying to determine in assessment, in the assessment phase, is the question that I posed before. What is the current culture? What's its current state? How do we really know that? So that's where we need different points of data and input and perspectives. And of course, in many cases, it isn't really by design. And that's part of what we're going to find out as well during some of the assessment work. We usually assess around the two pillars here that come from the three main areas of the triangle, you may recall, which was technical, management, and leadership. So assessment looks at the organizational systems and processes and practices and looks at leadership as well. It's the hard and the soft side of culture. And we'll come back and talk a bit more about this. In fact, my next couple slides expand on this a little bit further. The first one around management processes and systems. There's an old, some of you who may have roots back in the total quality management, continuous quality improvement era, which is where one of my earlier books, my second book, Firing on All Cylinders, came from. know that there's something called the 85-15 rule, not to be confused with the 80-20 Pareto principle. The 85-15 rule says that when you do root cause analysis and really look down at the root causes of errors, rework, customer dissatisfaction, and the productivity issues and so on, what you find is that 85 to 95% of the time it is in the system, the process, or the structure. So that's on the management side of that equation. Peter Senge, in his classic book, which is I think about 20 years old now, The Fifth Discipline, which was all about systems thinking, he made this point that when you place the same person in the put a person in a system, that people tend to act the same in that system. And what we so often see is when you train or change or shift frontline service providers, for example, but don't change anything else about the systems and processes that support them, you tend to get similar behavior. There's always exceptions to it, but that tends to be the overall rule. So that's part of where we're coming from on the management side of this assessment work, or what are the systems? So the culture, you recall, we talk about it as the way we do things around here, particularly when the boss isn't around. So when we're assessing, we're looking at, well, do we have a sense of desired behavior? Now, usually in the early stages, we don't yet really have clarity on that, but we may have gotten some sense of it early on. And what we want to get at, though, is what is the tolerated and accepted behavior? So the desired behavior would be what people say, what we say we want, what the values and other documents say we want. And then the tolerated and accepted is what really happens in lots of cases. So it's the blending, again, of the soft and the hard side, the soft side being people, their perceptions, their attitudes, and the leadership behaviors that are exhibited or perceived, and the hard side being the processes, the systems, and the management practices. So that's kind of the broad foundation, and what we'll often do in assessment work is use our compass model. It's not exclusively that we do this every time. Sometimes we'll use other frameworks or models, but you may recall that 3 of the 6 main points on this compass were on the soft side, the leadership side, not exclusively on that side, but that's primarily where that focus is, and 3 of the 6 main areas or points are on the management side of that equation, and so are dealing with things like processes and systems and some of what we've just looked at. So what are the options then? So that's kind of the background. That's how we start off many times. What are the different options and ways of doing that assessment work? Well, we often will use focus groups. So as a neutral outsider, we can come in, we can sit down and ask questions of groups of employees, managers, whatever it may be. In the early stages of working with clients, we'll try to figure out who should be in those focus groups, what's a good representative sample, cross-section of the organization. We may do some surveys, or you may have survey data. A client may have some survey data already, engagement surveys, customer satisfaction surveys, various kinds of surveys, so we may look at folding some of that into the discussion. Often we'll end up doing personal interviews, either by phone or in person, particularly around executive team development work, which I'll be getting to a little bit later on. We typically will do a lot of interviews, one-on-one interviews, and then it may as well be supplemented with, or in some cases, we do a lighter type of assessment where we're just using email, open-ended email questions, again, which have been designed ahead of time in working with whoever it is that we're working with, which is typically a senior executive, CEO, or someone like that, and a support person in HR or safety or whoever the person may be. We may also then do some reviewing of current documents, like what processes, systems, things you have in place, any other sorts of audits that have been done, or other surveys, whatever data the organization currently has that might be a useful part of looking at the overall picture. And at other times, we'll do this combination where we'll go in sometimes and do a bit of an awareness workshop. So, for example, we've had a couple of clients where we've gone in and done maybe a half-day or a one-day session with a broad cross-section, sometimes the entire employee group if it's not a huge organization. Other times there may be a series of workshops where we introduce some of the concepts like lead, follow, or wallow, or management versus leadership and the balancing of those two, and what are some of the core principles of leadership. So we kind of broadly outline all of that, and then we step back and say, okay, now where do you think the organization is at as we look at some of those basic concepts? So it's a bit of a combination of both awareness and assessment together. And then lastly, we may use more criteria-based assessments where we have scales and might be 1 to 10 or percentage points. These are things like the Baldrige or the Canada Awards for Excellence or other auditing kinds of approaches might use. So our assessment people, Scott Schweier, by the way, is my partner in this business who does a lot of this work either himself or with other associates that he'll be bringing in to work with the client. So that's a broad look at assessment options. Let's then move on to the next step. Typically the next step is an executive retreat. At times we may start with an executive retreat, do some self-assessment at the retreat, do some further assessment following the retreat, or we may do a kind of a parallel thing where we'll start with the retreat, begin to get the thing scoped out, start a bit of assessment as we start to implement some other components of it. So it's hard oftentimes in a presentation like this to outline all the options, but there's a couple of different ways we could approach it there. The retreat is really broken into two major parts. The first day usually, so these are usually 2 days, sometimes they're 3, but the first day is often where we're reviewing whatever assessment may have been done. We're doing some learning, developing concepts, ideas, building awareness. We are doing some sort of envisioning where we want to go, what this culture change is about, what it means to us. We might start prioritizing leadership behaviors and look at things like systems and processes that are helping or hindering what we're trying to do here. So that's, again, very broadly. Each one of these is pretty customized. I've done hundreds of them over the years, and there's a broad framework, but they do get quite customized. The second day, generally, or second, third day, is where we would now zero in on 3 or 4 strategic imperatives is the term that we use, and these are the must-do things if we're going to move the culture forward, if we're going to make some significant inroads in the next 6 to 12 months towards our vision, our values, etc. What is it that we've absolutely got to do? And then we're going to set up our steering team and our whole infrastructure to implement all of this and the framework that goes with it. And I'll explain more of that later on and give you a bit more of a detail and some examples around how that's done. So that's typically a couple of days. It may combine with, as I said before, where we're doing awareness workshops. Sometimes we've done sessions where we have, say, a larger management team and might be 40 or 50, sometimes even bigger, 100, 200, and we'll then narrow it down in a funneling sort of effect. And the largest group I've worked with over 4 days actually was a large international group. We did this in West Africa where we had 130 managers together from 5 different continents, and we were winnowing through and really boiling down over a 4-day period with a little time off for some recreation. And then we took that back to the executive team for final decisions. So as we look at these steps and look at the executive retreat, I want to just illustrate a few more points around the retreat itself. First of all, coming back to what we saw in the McKinsey work, that how leaders lead all of this forward, the kind of development for leaders, the sorts of things that we focus in on and leadership skills that we build are absolutely critical to this work, because very much the organization's culture does ripple out from the management team that's leading it. And that basic premise is at the center of the retreat and the beginning point of the retreat. And part of what we end up discussing at the retreat then, and this may have come out in earlier assessment work, or we may talk about it more at the retreat, is back to this continuum that I explained in our first webcast. Some of our clients have done some excellent work around this continuum, around what involved leadership looks like, what integration looks like. We usually begin or start or really boost that whole conversation during the retreat to keep the focus on the executive's behaviors. So the sort of options for the 2 days, a little more detail now to that broad brush I just gave you, is we'll usually do some kind of foundation building around these three main foundation pieces that you saw in the last webcast. And we'll then come in back into or look at whatever assessment data we do have at this point, or assessment input, or maybe do some assessment there. And then we'll start to get the executive team into reviewing or developing. These days, which is different than 20, 25 years ago when I first started doing this work, lots of executive teams hadn't done much in this area. Today, many have, and so it may be a case of we have to go back and revitalize, re-energize, revisit some of this work, often need to boil it down, simplify it, and really zero in on, so what are the leadership behaviors then that go with all these wonderful motherhood statements and great sounding phrases? How do we really make that live through the behavior of the executive team? We'll then get into identifying those strategic imperatives, either revising current ones that you have or developing further ones, or maybe even if you haven't done much of this, we might develop new ones here. The strategic plan, whatever strategic planning has been done, might start to come into play here as well. Another optional part, and this is where sometimes the retreats will get extended a little bit, or I just did a retreat a couple of weeks ago where this was the main focus of the retreat, and we really started around the executive team and team development, and that was where we put a lot of emphasis, and we did a lot of, I did one-on-one interviews with each member of the team. We did surveys on their conflict profile, how they work together. There was a team that was fairly new as an executive team, but they were struggling and having some real challenges. And to the CEO's credit, he knew that unless the team gets their act together and really starts to function strongly as a team, their chances of impacting the culture in a positive way are really small. And so we put the focus there. We're now following up with further implementation work. We may also end up doing moose hunting, either during the session, or this may have come out in the earlier assessment work. If you're not familiar with that concept, one of my books is by that, but the title, Moose on the Table. It's the idea, like elephant in the room. It's issues that we are maybe not addressing. We might know that they're there. We're avoiding them. We're not dealing with them for whatever reason. And so the retreat might be a place where we start to flush out and flesh out further what some of those issues might be. And then we'll start to set up the implementation infrastructure. Now, later on, in the next steps, I'll get deeper into this. And again, this is where we see lots of variation. It depends on the size of the organization. It depends on the complexity of the implementation. It depends on what sort of work's already been done in this area or not. So this gets quite customized. And then the last part that is so critical and is the Achilles heel of so many planning processes is we all leave the retreat feeling great, got all these plans. 6 months later, a year later, nothing much has happened, and everybody kind of looks back and says, what did we ever do with that stuff? Anybody ever know what came of that? And so having real discipline about follow-through, follow-up, and building that in as part of the process is absolutely vital. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of some of what I've covered. Strategic imperatives. Here's a list. This is just a generic list. It's from maybe, 6 or 8 different clients. It's showing what are some examples of things that they might identify. We suggest most organizations can't handle more than about 3 or 4 at the very tops, because as you'll see later on, the way they need to be staffed, the way we need to really resource these, we generally can't take on a whole large number of them. Here's a client example of an implementation plan. This is a live example. Scott's actually working with his client right now. It's an overseas organization that are in the healthcare and education business. They operate in a number of different continents. This was the organization that I did the work with in West Africa with the strategic planning, and this is now a year later as we're continuing to move all of that work along. And so they have focused in on 5 main areas. They're a pretty big organization. They have almost 10,000 employees. They cover a number of different countries. And so they're looking at this as a way of integrating and pulling together a number of initiatives, with the focus on culture as being the overarching major one, and the core values and behaviors that go with that. And then what will follow and be part of it will be some management leadership development work. They haven't done a lot in that area so far. They have a number of strategic imperatives and strategies inside of their divisions and major parts of the organization, and those really need to be integrated and pulled together much more effectively. They also want to zero in on accountability, decision-making, and clarifying roles and responsibilities and governance structures across the organization, and they need to get much better at pruning and prioritizing and identifying major things that need to stop in order to make room for new initiatives and just things that have taken on a life of their own that really aren't all that effective anymore. So all of this, these would be examples of how we're trying to, that last point particularly, how we're trying to realign, integrate, prune current projects and processes. There's very few organizations, I can't think of one I've worked with recently, that have basically said, we've got lots of time, we've got lots of resources, we can easily handle more, just pile it on. Almost every organization, the big problem is overload, way too much happening, way too many priorities, way too many projects, way too many things going on. And so here we are now saying, hey, we're going to roll out a new one. Here's a culture initiative. We're just going to add it on top. Well, it's just not going to work unless we figure out how to get rid of stuff that's currently there now or align this with work that's already going on. Because as I showed in my previous slide, the puzzle slide was looking at how we've got all these bits and pieces going on all around the organization, and the larger the organization, the more likely there's this fragmentation going on, and we've got to pull it all back together. So one of the key elements here, as Jim Collins points out in his book Good to Great, that great companies, those that really make progress and are really the long-term, highly effective organizations, put as much focus on stop-doing lists, on pruning, discipline. In fact, in the introduction of this book, he talks about how it's really a book about discipline. And what sets great organizations apart from average ones is the degree of discipline they bring to these kinds of activities. And so, for example, we've done work with clients where we actually start to inventory and list what all the projects and committee structures are. And just getting that list together can be an enormous amount of work because no one has ever really seen it all in one place. That can take a lot of time. We then will look at how can we prune, consolidate, bring together maybe some of those committees or projects and realign them under the big, broad strategic imperatives that we've just talked about. And where do we start to cut things out? The famous GE work-out process that was started years ago, which has now been imitated in all kinds of forms by many organizations over the years. So that should free up the time, resources, and that's certainly the goal, is to build or cut out or carve out some time so that we can do this other work. So building on that, and steps 3 and 4 can be quite interlocked, quite interconnected, running in parallel to each other. These can take a couple of months to work through, again, depending on the size of the organization, the amount of work, how big the implementation might be. But in step 4, we're really now starting to outline what the whole strategy, timelines, process might look like. At risk of scaring you off a little bit with this diagram, I'm going to show you a diagram that is quite generic, but it's really showing that there are two main parts to an infrastructure. There's the overall organization, might be the corporation, corporate steering team, or the organizational steering team, whatever terms you might use, but it's the overall coordinating team, and usually headed up by the CEO or senior executive, and there's some kind of support person, a coordinator or someone in a support role. And then each site or division or department, now these would be major sites, division, departments. Again, if it's a smaller organization, it may not have this distinction, but certainly once you start getting into organizations of a few thousand people or more, typically we start to get into this kind of distinction where then there might be a local steering team, a local department, a local division, a local country, whatever it may be. And so whoever heads up, who's the head of that local group, would be the executive owner and sometimes maybe team leader as well, although we tend to separate those two roles. And then team members might be 8 or 10 of them who are on those local teams. And those teams And here again, we could have both strategic, corporate teams and local teams, where it can start to get a little bit more complicated. But what they're doing is identifying major projects. So I've put in the box there typical things you'd find in any good project management approach, where you're looking at the overall context, what the deliverables are, the outcome, the action plans, timelines. There may be a leader for that. There may even be a steering team, depending how big the project is. And then, of course, the team members there could be different team members than are at the layer above, or it might be some of the same people. And then there might even be an action team so they're acting in a steering capacity, and there's a team then that's really making it happen. That could be the case, or it could be all just one group that's doing all of these activities. So what I've shown then are that this carries on for maybe 2 or 3 or 4 different projects. And now you start to get in a sense of why we suggest that most organizations can't handle more than about 3 major strategic imperatives, possibly 4, because to do it this way, with this kind of rigor, this kind of discipline, this kind of infrastructure, because this is really where it gets real. This is where these good intentions and these plans that get laid out there at strategic planning time and during retreats and so on either come alive and get real and get implemented or not. So are we prepared to put the time, energy, and resources into laying all of this out, into identifying who these people should be and getting it all put into place? So I'm going to show you a couple of other examples or a couple of other points. Some of our clients, we've used this way of trying to simplify some of these steps that I'm showing you, which is to basically say, okay, let's start with our vision, values, core, and purpose, which would have come out of the retreat. Let's look at the behaviors. Again, that would have been started in the retreat, and we now flesh them out further, get much more deeper into describing exactly what all the behaviors are that are centered around core values or the culture we're trying to build. It gets into then looking at, are processes helping or hindering, moving us forward, or are they making it harder for people to behave effectively in line with the values and the culture? And then we need to get down to frontline staff. For example, Barrick Gold, who we worked with a few years back, making a huge implementation of a safety culture. They did 2 days worth of training with all supervisors and managers around the world in all 28 mines, and then they took every miner, everybody in the entire organization, through a one-day version. So they trained like 25,000 people in what are the core behaviors of the courageous safety culture we're trying to build here. And then lastly, we start to the sorts of things I just showed you with teams and projects and groups and all the different kinds of improvement activities that start to really come out of all of that. So that slide is trying to summarize, these are what the typical sorts of steps are for some organizations. That second last point about frontline staff, leader behaviors, is what this slide gets to around education and communications. That here's a blinding flash of the obvious that obviously isn't so obvious in many organizations. First of all, managers dramatically often underestimate how much they have to repeat and continue to hammer home the same kinds of messages and stories and examples, and that we can't really transform the organization if people don't buy in and understand and are really ready to be part and want to and are keen to be part of this. And so over-communication is rarely a source of employee dissatisfaction. So that's what that point about the employee education is often getting at. And in many organizations, we end up with something called the WAY programs. It's the XYZ way, the ABC way, whatever your organization name is. I'm going to show you a couple of actual examples here for some clients. This was a mining company called FNX. They've now since merged with Quadra, but they identified 4 major values. And so the top part of the chart shows those values and the commitment that management makes to the organization. Then we see all team members, what the expectations are of all team members around each of those 4 values, and you see some of the leader behaviors. I'm not showing you the entire thing here. Sometimes we call this culture on a page because we're trying to boil it down to one place. Here's another client. This is in the logistics and distribution business called Metro Retail Logistics, and they have 4 values that are centered around our customer, our team, our company, our world. And again, to support those values, here are the key business practices everybody must behave, must follow, and then we start to get down into more of the layers and details from there. Here's one we're working with right now in Australia, which is an organization that is using my 3 rings model from Firing on All Cylinders. So the 3 ring are over at the left-hand side, basic, expected, and exceptional. And so they then are mirroring, and we're helping them to build a 360 tool, feedback tool, and assessment tool around this. So this is just a work in progress at the moment. But it's showing the leadership role at each of those levels and some of the behavior descriptions. Again, we're still working on these, and there's more to be done, but it's showing a 4-point scale. So the 360 tool will be asking individuals to choose one of those 4 points on each one of the leadership roles, the bullet points in the second left-hand column. So they'll have to choose one of the descriptions for each one of those, and then that'll all be automated and put together on our software program and fed back in the reports to the managers. All right, so our last step is monitoring, following up, and adjusting the implementation plans. And as I said a few minutes ago, this is where this stuff gets real or not. This is where, as Jim Clemmer said, the real discipline of highly effective organizations shines through. Do we really follow through and make this happen? So we've used for years something we call a goal deployment system. It's pretty simple and straightforward, but it's one of those things that's easy to understand, seems to be enormously difficult to do. So at the center is the focus and context, which are vision, values, purpose. That's our term for that. And so the 3 to 5 strategic imperatives, I showed you some examples of those earlier. So whatever the executive group has decided those are. So we then identify, so who's owning and accountable for each one of those, either through the strategic imperative team and or at the local level in my day-to-day team and my day-to-day work. So it's a matrix type cross-ownership of that. And then we get into developing key measures, leading and lagging indicators, and some organizations are using things like balanced scorecard or dashboards or different tools that we can incorporate in here and use. And then cascading that to all team levels and members. This is where things start to break down with many organizations. They often don't get this far, and very few get all the way through to cascading those reviews and following through right through quarterly reviews, biannually, whatever it may be, and then taking us back again to the next year's cycle as we continue the process along. So it's the how we follow it through, how we mobilize, get everybody involved, back to some of the McKinsey work, how we empower, engage. It's through those kinds of processes that we do that. So my last slide before we'll open up for questions here is as a bit of a summary or review. What is it that the CLEMMER Group can help you with? Well, what our goal here, the little logo that we developed years ago, is a book springing into action. How's that not so cool? We paid a lot of money for that logo, so I hope you enjoy that. But that's our goal, is to try to spring all of this into action. And so we have Scott and his team do a lot of ongoing consulting, guiding, supporting the implementation team and the strategic imperatives teams with the plan and so forth. Quite customized, going to depend on how much help the organization needs. We do a lot of custom design of training, development materials, many of them around some of my books. The Leader's Digest book is one that companies like Barrick and probably half a dozen or a dozen others have used. It has a central framework, our leadership wheel, as we call it, 7 principles of leadership. So we build exercises and applications and all sorts of with videos and all kinds of things that can be built in around that. So all of it is highly customized. We can design and deliver it and customize the modules, or with some of our clients, we do some of the initial design and delivery, and then we train internal people to continue delivering. The ABC way, the XYZ way, the FNX way, since I showed you that example, the Barrick way, the Metro way. These are what a lot of clients end up doing, and we build quite extensive experiential programs that really immerse individuals right into experiences, lots of activities. It might be games, exercises, things that really help them to get it at the gut level, at the heart level, what the values, the culture are, rather than just throwing a bunch of PowerPoint slides at them, like I'm doing to you today, and just doing it all at the head level. This is very much getting into the heart level. We also then link in and help to design performance management processes, systems, 360. There's a whole array of tools that may be part of that. We do quite a bit of work, and we have some expertise within our group around strategic mapping, business process mapping. We talk about it as strategic because a lot of process work happens at a more tactical level. We try to make it more strategic level. We do a lot of work around the customer focus area and have a number of models and frameworks to do with improving customer focus. And these days, employee engagement is often an area that lots of organizations are concerned with getting help with, so we provide services with that. And the safety area is one that we've been doing quite a bit of work with over the last few years that really came out of the success of the Barrick work. They dropped their long-term injury rates, LTIs, by 75% over 3 years, which has been a massive story in the mining industry, and that's spun off all sorts of other clients that we've worked with. And more recently, we've designed called Be Safe, which is an acronym that stands for 6 steps for safety, and it's providing training for frontline people and supervisors and so on. All right, so at this point, we'll introduce Julie. Julie Gill has been with the CLEMMER Group for quite a long time, 15 years or so, I think now. And Julie helps to keep all of our technology straight. Without her, I'm not sure what I would ever do, as we just saw when she jumped in and bailed me out with the phone problem. So Julie's been monitoring questions, and you'll hear her voice, and she'll bring in some questions.
Hi there. Thanks very much, Jim. We have one question from Larry. What surveys do you use to determine existing culture?
Well, there's a variety of surveys. We do have organizational surveys that might be built around values. That's one that we tend to use quite a bit, where we'll build a survey around the core values of the organization, such as you saw with that Australian example. That's a little bit of a variation of that. Sometimes we have surveys that are more standard organizational surveys that might bring in concepts from emotional intelligence and or some of the soft side. We have surveys that are built around the 6 main areas of the transformation pathways framework, which I showed earlier. So we have quite specific surveys that are built around that. As I say, a lot of this is quite customized.
Okay, another question. I agree with the importance of infrastructure. However, slide 24 has a lot of local teams, local steering teams, SI teams, and action teams. Can you further clarify the differences between them, highlighting why each is needed? Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, well, I'll go back to that slide. The challenge here is that this can start to overwhelm and look a little bit scary, but it depends so much on the organization. What I'll describe is where you might use all of these in a fairly complex implementation. So let's say that an organization has said leadership development is one of the major initiatives, strategic imperative, which is a common one that we'll see. So the corporate steering team would look at leadership development broadly, and they might bring in, they clearly, hopefully, would bring in HR, OD, other training people as part of that steering team, but might then also bring in other managers as part of that team. And so they might design a corporate initiative and a corporate program. But then when it comes down to the local implementation, some organizations, we've been working with one recently, it's actually in the public sector, has decided to focus their leadership training, this is unusual, but it's an example, on the team and the individuals, not just individuals. So the teams get together and they work on initiatives as a team. So the local steering team would be making that distinction, would be deciding, well, what initiatives do we want them to get working on? What key projects do we want them to work on? Let's then weave some of the leadership training into those projects. And so when you jump down to key project number 1, one of the projects might be we need to streamline our processes here in this division or in this department. And so there might be a team that's formed to map out the process, all the key members of that process, and they would then, they may be the action team as well, or there might be sub-teams. So it might be you've got an overall team mapping out the whole process. Let's say you've got a division of, 500, 1,000 people, fairly large. They're taking a big core process, and they might then be starting to cut down deeper into the invoicing part of that process, the customer the customer interface part of that process, or the production part of that process. So now you may have individual action teams. Some people on this call may know of Kaizen teams, which are individual teams that are now looking at how to improve that part of the process. But it needs to be coordinated by an overall steering group. Otherwise, you get sub-optimization, which happens so frequently, where those little individual action teams are motoring away, doing good work, improving the process, but they're making it worse somewhere further down the line because nobody is coordinating the whole thing. So that's a kind of a quick example of how it might cascade down through the organization. But it typically is a fairly complex organization when you start to get all those layers, or a fairly large organization.
Okay, next question. How long does implementation take?
Well, it's going to depend, again, on the complexity of the organization and how quickly what resources you want to put into it, and how quickly you want to get things moving along. We've seen very substantial and successful implementations happen over a period of a few months in medium to smaller organizations. In larger, more international, complex organizations, it could take a year or two till you really begin to hit critical mass and start to see some major change happening.
Okay. How many people typically attend a retreat?
Well, the retreats depend on whether we're just doing a one-of session where we're just doing the session with the executive team only, or whether it might be a session that combines the executive team with the management group. And so we oftentimes, if it's just the executive team, I'm going to go back to our slide. If it's just the executive team, we will end up with 6 or 8 people usually. If it's the somewhat larger team, the extended executive team, it might be 14, 18 people. And then if it's a bit of awareness session first, it could be, I did a series of these recently with that Australian client where we had 50 people, 200 on the Monday, 50 on Tuesday and Wednesday, 20 on Thursday, and down to the executive team on Friday. So it was a progressive process.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Does the full organization need to be involved from the top executive team right down the organization?
Ideally, we start at the executive group and work our way down through the organization. Occasionally, we can't, for whatever reason, get the executive on side, or there's a division or a part of the organization that's really keen to get going and can't really wait for the executive team to get going. And so if they have a fair degree of autonomy and a fair degree of control over the main parts of their processes, they can be quite successful with that. But there's always going to be some of that limitation that the bigger overall culture perhaps isn't really shifting and might even in some cases be throwing challenges in front of the team.
Okay. What's the next step from this webinar if we're interested in exploring how the CLEMMER Group could help us?
Well, the next step would be a conversation with either myself, Heather, or Kara, who will probably be in touch with you, and to more specifically look at what your situation is, what you might be wanting to do, and how we may be able to help you with that.
I have one more question. If anyone else has any other questions, please send them in. We have a few more minutes. Here's the question. Do you conduct keynotes or workshops based on this material without a full-blown culture implementation?
Absolutely. We do that quite a lot. And again, highly customized. It might be a keynote at a management conference or meeting, or half-day, one-day, two-day kinds of workshops that are focused more on individual skill development and may not be getting into some of these cultural issues at all.
Okay, I think that is the end of our questions.
All right, great. Well, thanks very much for everybody attending. I hope that you came away with a much clearer sense of how the CLEMMER Group might be able to help you. And as I've said all along, these are quite customized, so we really need to talk more specifically about your own situation and what we can do to help you with that. So thanks again, and all the best in your culture building activities. Bye for now.